8,000 babies a year. That's how many infants were dying in New York City in the 1850s from what doctors called cholera infantum, and what was actually what historians now call the Swill Milk Scandal, a coordinated, profitable, decade-long cover-up that almost nobody got punished for. Picture Manhattan in 1858. The streets are packed, the tenements are overflowing, and in nearly every working-class apartment in the city, there's a bottle of milk sitting on a table. Mothers are pouring it into the mouths of their children. They've been told it's safe. The label on the wagon that delivered it said, "Pure country milk." It came from green pastures upstate. That's the story anyway. It didn't. It came from a stable next to a whiskey distillery where cows with open sores on their bodies stood in their own waste, drinking the alcoholic runoff from the booze industry next door. The milk those cows produced was thin, bluish, and full of bacteria. So before it left the dairy, men whitened it with plaster of Paris, thickened it with starch and raw eggs, and tinted it the colour of cream with molasses. Then they loaded it onto wagons painted with the words, "Pure country milk," and sent it into the city to be fed to children. The cover-up worked for years. Inspectors who were supposed to stop it were on the payroll. Health officials who were supposed to investigate it looked the other way. And when one cow got too sick to stand, too riddled with ulcers, too far gone to keep producing, the dairymen had a solution for that too. They drugged her with opium, propped her up, and milked her one more time. This is how an industry killed 8,000 babies a year and called it commerce. And it took one journalist, one newspaper, and a series of drawings that New Yorkers couldn't unsee to finally tear it apart. To understand how the cover-up worked, you have to understand the problem the cover-up was solving. And the problem was geography. By the 1850s, New York City was exploding. Hundreds of thousands of new residents had crammed onto Manhattan Island in a single generation, and they all needed to eat. Specifically, they all needed milk. The middle and upper classes had been told by physicians that cow milk was the next best thing to breast milk, and the lower classes needed it for the same reason every poor parent has ever needed cheap calories, because there wasn't much else. But Manhattan had no pastures. The grazing land was gone, paved over, built on, sold off. The nearest dairy country was up in Orange and Westchester counties, and getting milk down from there to the city meant loading it onto a hot rail car where it would sit and spoil before it ever reached a customer. There was no refrigeration. There was no pasteurization. Louis Pasteur wouldn't even publish his work on it until 1864. Fresh country milk in Manhattan was for most families basically impossible. So the market did what markets do. It found a workaround. The workaround was the distillery. Whiskey production was booming in New York, and every distillery generated mountains of leftover grain mash, the wet, fermented slop left over after the alcohol was pulled out. The mash still had calories in it. It could feed an animal. And if you put a stable full of cows directly next to your distillery, you could pipe the swill straight from one building to the other. No transport costs, no spoilage. The cows would produce milk on site, in the middle of the city, ready to sell that morning. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, it was a nightmare. The cows were packed into tiny stalls, never let outside, standing in their own filth for their entire lives. They developed ulcers, their teeth fell out, tumours grew on their udders, their hooves rotted. Many of them were drunk, actually literally drunk on the alcoholic residue in the swill, for most of their short lives. And these were the animals producing the milk being fed to American babies. The distillery owners knew exactly what they had. A product that cost almost nothing to make, sold for real money, and looked, if you handled it right, close enough to real milk that nobody would ask questions. All they had to do was make sure nobody could prove what was actually in the bottle. That's where the cover-up began. The first problem the swill milk dealers had to solve was the obvious one. Their product didn't look like milk. Real milk, the kind that came from a healthy cow eating grass, was thick. It had body. It was a warm, creamy white, sometimes verging on yellow if the cow was in good condition. Swill milk was none of those things. It came out of those distillery cows thin, watery, and a sickly bluish colour. Pour it into a glass next to the real thing, and a child could tell the difference. So the dealers turned themselves into chemists. The first ingredient they added was plaster of Paris. Yes, the same powder used to make cast moulds and patch walls. Stirred into thin, blue milk, it brightened the colour and made the liquid look opaque and wholesome. It also, incidentally, settled in human stomachs in ways that human stomachs are not designed to process. But it solved the optics problem. Next came the texture problem. Real milk has fat, swill milk didn't, so the dealers added starch and raw eggs, beaten in until the consistency thickened up to something resembling cream. Then, to warm the colour from a chalky white to that appealing golden cream tone customers expected, they added molasses. A few drops mixed in carefully, and suddenly the bottle on the counter looked like it had come straight from a Vermont dairy that morning. Plaster of Paris, starch, eggs, molasses. That was the recipe. That was what was being poured into bottles and handed to infants whose digestive systems had no defense against any of it. And it gets worse, because the cows themselves were a problem the dealers had to manage. A cow with open sores and a tumour on her udder produces milk that is visibly contaminated, streaked with pus, sometimes streaked with blood. You can't sell that even with a cover story. So when the cows got too sick, the dealers had to keep them functional just long enough to extract one last round of product. Their solution was opium. Sick cows that could no longer stand were drugged with opiates, propped upright in their stalls, and milked one more time before being slaughtered. Cows that were dying of disease were kept alive on narcotics specifically so they could produce another few quarts of saleable milk. There are accounts of cows so weak they had to be held up with ropes and pulleys while workers extracted what they could from them. This was not a one-off. This was the standard operating procedure of an industry. And it was happening every day in stables that working New Yorkers walked past on their way to work, in the heart of one of the largest cities in the world. The next question is how nobody stopped it. And the answer to that is where the cover-up gets really dark. A scam this big doesn't survive on chemistry alone. You can disguise the milk all you want. But if a single honest health inspector walks into one of those stables and writes an honest report, the whole thing collapses overnight. So the swill milk industry made sure no honest report ever got written. New York City in the 1850s did, technically, have public health authorities. There was the New York Board of Health, there were health wardens. On paper, their job was to investigate exactly this kind of thing. Adulterated food, unsanitary production, dangers to the public. In practice, they were a fiction. The New York Times would later run an editorial calling the entire inspection apparatus a sham, accusing it of having no real power and no real intention to use what little power it did have. And the reason was simple. The swill milk business was enormously profitable, and a small bribe in the right pocket was a lot cheaper than fixing the conditions in a stable. So inspectors were paid to stay away. Wardens were paid to file clean reports. Politicians who might have made noise were paid to stay quiet. The money moved up the chain, and the milk moved out into the city, and the babies kept dying, and the system kept calling those deaths cholera infantum, marasmus, summer complaint, anything but what they were, which was poisoning for profit. But the cover-up didn't stop at bribery. It went into marketing. The dealers understood that their best customers, the lower and middle-class mothers who couldn't afford anything else, were also the customers most likely to ask questions. So they gave those mothers an answer before they could ask. They painted the sides of their delivery wagons with the words pure country milk. They put up signs at street corners advertising Orange County milk, named after the rural dairy region upstate, where real milk actually came from. They printed labels suggesting their product had been brought in fresh from the green hills of Westchester that morning. None of it was true. The milk in those wagons had been produced an hour earlier in a stable 2 blocks away, next to a distillery owned by men like Bradish Johnson, by a cow standing in her own waste. But the branding was good. The branding was convincing. And in a city where most people had never seen a real dairy farm, the branding was all anyone had to go on. It was, in modern terms, a coordinated disinformation campaign. The product was lethal. The marketing said it was wholesome. The regulators said nothing. And the consumers, the mothers handing bottles to their babies, had no way to tell the difference until their child was already dying. This system held for years. Years. The deaths piled up, the profits compounded, and the men running it slept comfortably in homes their swill milk money had paid for. Reformers like Robert Hartley had tried to sound the alarm for years before anyone listened, publishing exposés in the 1840s that fell on deaf ears. And then, in 1858, somebody finally went into one of those stables with a notebook and an artist. The man who finally broke the story was named Frank Leslie, and he ran an illustrated newspaper that printed pictures of things New Yorkers were not supposed to see. Leslie's paper was different from the competition in one critical way. Most newspapers of the era were walls of text, dense columns of small type that readers had to wade through. Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper put images on the front page, big, detailed engravings drawn by artists who went out into the city and sketched what they actually saw. It was, in 1858, a radical format. It also turned out to be the perfect weapon for a story like this one. In May of that year, Leslie published the first installment of what would become an 8-article series on the swill milk trade. He sent his reporters and his illustrators directly into the distillery stables. They walked the floors, they drew the cows, the sores, the missing teeth, the rotted hooves, the animals being held up by ropes so they could be milked. They drew the men doing the work. They drew the wagons labelled pure country milk being loaded with the product of those stables. And then he printed it. What had been an abstract problem, a vague sense that something was wrong with city milk, suddenly had a face. Several faces, actually. Readers could see in detail the conditions their breakfast had been produced in. They could see the cows. They could see the filth. They could see the bottles being filled. And for an audience that had been told for years that they were drinking pure country milk, the pictures were a special kind of betrayal. The response was immediate and enormous. Other papers picked up the story. The New York Times ran an editorial titled, "How We Poison Our Children," a direct accusation pointed straight at the city's health authorities. Public outrage moved from kitchen tables to government meetings. The New York Academy of Medicine launched a formal investigation and confirmed what Leslie had reported, with physicians like Dr. Samuel Percy testifying about the dangers. Milk from cows fed on whiskey swill was directly contributing to the city's infant mortality rate. The 8,000 deaths a year figure became impossible to deny. But here is the part of the story that almost nobody tells. The exposé did not actually end the trade. Not right away, not even close. The dealers fought back. They bribed harder, they rebranded faster, they sued the newspapers, they lobbied politicians. They produced their own counter-experts to argue that swill milk was, in fact, nutritious. They flooded the public conversation with so much noise that for years afterward, the trade kept operating in a slightly modified form, with slightly different labels, in slightly less visible locations. The milk wars, as this period came to be called, dragged on. New York didn't pass its first real pure milk law until 1862, 4 full years after Leslie's exposé. And even that law was barely enforced. The cover-up, in other words, didn't die when it was exposed. It just had to work harder. So here is where the story turns, because the Swill Milk Scandal didn't just kill thousands of babies. It changed what America was willing to tolerate. For most of the country's existence up to that point, food safety had been a private matter. If you bought something and it killed you, that was your problem. Caveat emptor, buyer beware. The idea that the government had any business stepping into a kitchen, or a stable, or a bottling line was considered foreign and slightly un-American. The market was supposed to handle it. Bad actors were supposed to lose customers. The system was supposed to be self-correcting. The Swill Milk Scandal proved, in the most unambiguous way possible, that the system was not self-correcting. The market did not punish the dealers, it rewarded them. The customers could not protect themselves. They had been actively deceived. The regulators did not regulate. They had been bought. Every safeguard the philosophy of laissez-faire promised would emerge naturally had failed completely. And 8,000 dead infants a year were the receipts. That realization is what eventually built the modern American food safety apparatus, not all at once, not cleanly. The 1862 New York Pure Milk Law was, as we said, mostly toothless, but the principle it established, that the government had a legitimate role in inspecting and regulating what gets sold as food, survived. It got stronger. By the 1890s, Louis Pasteur's work on pasteurization had crossed the Atlantic and was being applied to the milk supply, killing the bacteria that swill milk had spread for decades. By 1906, federal pressure had built to the point that Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, championed by Harvey Wiley, the chemist who would become known as the father of the FDA, and the agency we now call the FDA was born. You can draw a straight line from those distillery stables in 1850s Manhattan to the nutrition label on the carton in your fridge right now. The reason that label exists, the reason there are inspectors empowered to walk into a dairy and shut it down, the reason pure country milk is a phrase the FDA can prosecute someone for printing on a wagon. All of it traces back to the moment when the cover-up failed, and Americans collectively decided that buyer beware was not an acceptable answer to dead children. The dealers who ran the swill trade mostly walked away rich. The inspectors who looked the other way faced no real consequences. Frank Leslie's paper kept publishing for another 40 years, and Leslie himself died in 1880. His place in history secured by the engravings on those front pages. The cows, of course, didn't get to walk away from anything, but the system the scandal built outlasted all of them. And the next time you pour a glass of milk and notice, without thinking about it, that the carton lists every ingredient, that there's a date on the bottom, that there's a license number on the side, that the milk inside is exactly what it claims to be, you are looking at the answer 8,000 dead babies forced America to give. It only took a journalist with a notebook, an artist with a sketch pad, and the unbearable arithmetic of the truth.